In the summer of 1929, a Yale economist declared that stock prices had reached a permanently high plateau. 14 weeks later, $14 billion had vanished. Banks padlocked their doors. Men who had been millionaires sold apples on street corners. In 2007, the chairman of the Federal Reserve assured Congress that subprime mortgage problems were likely to be contained. 18 months later, the global financial system stood hours from total collapse. Entire nations went bankrupt. A generation lost their homes, their savings, their futures. Now in the mid-2020s, the experts are calm again. They speak of soft landings, of resilient markets, of controlled inflation. But beneath the surface, the numbers tell a different story. A darker story, a story that has played out before. In ancient Rome, in Habsburg Spain, in the fall of the British Empire. What if the next collapse isn't just another recession? What if it's the end of an era? There is a moment, just before every great financial catastrophe, when the world feels impossibly stable. It happened in the autumn of 1929. The stock market had tripled in less than a decade. Unemployment was low, consumer confidence was high. Magazines published articles about the new era of prosperity, a world where the old rules of boom and bust no longer applied. It happened again in the summer of 2007. Housing prices had doubled in 6 years. Wall Street was minting billionaires. The Federal Reserve chairman spoke of a great moderation, an age when central banks had finally tamed the business cycle. In both cases, the crash came not despite the confidence, but because of it. And now, in the mid-2020s, we find ourselves in another moment of eerie calm. The markets have recovered. Inflation, we are told, is under control. The banking system is well capitalized. The economy is resilient. But something is wrong. The United States government now owes more than $35 trillion, a sum so vast it has lost all meaning. The interest payments alone will soon exceed the entire defense budget. Commercial real estate sits empty across every major city, a $1.5 trillion time bomb ticking beneath the banking sector. The derivatives market, the same web of financial bets that detonated in 2008, has grown to over $600 trillion, more than 6 times the entire global economy. And yet, the experts remain calm. This is not a documentary about prediction. Predictions are for fortune tellers and fools. This is a documentary about pattern recognition, about the structural forces that have preceded every great collapse in modern history. Because here is what the textbooks don't teach you. Financial crises are not random. They are not bolts from the blue. They follow a script, a sequence of stages that repeats with disturbing regularity across centuries and continents. The Dutch tulip mania of 1637, the South Sea bubble of 1720, the panic of 1873, the Great Depression, the Asian financial crisis, the dot-com bust, the global financial crisis of 2008, different eras, different technologies, different currencies. The same pattern. Every cycle begins with a displacement, a new innovation or policy that creates genuine opportunity. Railroads, electricity, the internet, cheap credit. Then comes the boom. Credit expands. Asset prices rise. Early investors make fortunes. Then euphoria. Taxi drivers give stock tips. Housewives flip condos. Shoeshine boys talk about margins. Then the quiet exit. The smart money slips out, barely noticed. Then panic. The herd realizes all at once that the music has stopped. Then contagion. What started in one sector spreads everywhere. Then despair. Wealth is destroyed. Jobs vanish. Governments fall. 7 stages. The same 7 stages. Over and over again. The question is not whether the pattern will repeat. The question is where we are in the cycle. And whether what comes next will be worse than anything we've seen before. The evidence suggests it will be, not because of any single cause, not because of one bad policy or one reckless bank, but because of the compounding effect of decades of choices, the slow accumulation of debt, the hollowing out of productive industry, the transfer of risk from the private sector to the public balance sheet, the quiet erosion of the currency that underpins the entire global order. 1929 destroyed a generation. It took 25 years for the stock market to recover its previous highs. It took a world war to pull the economy out of depression. 2008 was contained, but only through the largest intervention in financial history. Trillions of dollars were printed, interest rates were pinned to zero for a decade. The can was kicked down the road. But what happens when the road ends? What happens when the debt is too large to service, the currency too debased to trust, the institutions too discredited to lead? What happens when the next crisis arrives, and the tools that saved us last time have already been used? This is the story of three crashes. The one that created the modern financial system, the one that nearly destroyed it, and the one that may be waiting just around the corner. This is the story of empires that believed they were different. This is the story of the pattern nobody wants to see. In 1978, an economist named Charles Kindleberger published a book that Wall Street would spend the next 40 years trying to forget. It was called Manias, Panics, and Crashes. And within its pages, Kindleberger laid out something that bankers and policymakers had long denied. Financial crises are not random. They are not unpredictable acts of God. They follow a pattern, a recognizable, repeatable sequence of human behavior that has remained virtually unchanged for over 400 years. Kindleberger built upon the work of Hyman Minsky, a largely ignored economist who had spent his career studying the inherent instability of financial markets. Minsky's central insight was deceptively simple. Stability itself breeds instability. The longer a system appears safe, the more risk people are willing to take, until the risk becomes the system. Together, their work revealed something uncomfortable. Every bubble, every crash, every financial catastrophe, from the tulip mania to the Great Depression to the 2008 meltdown, followed the same 7-stage script. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Every financial mania begins with something real, a new technology, a new policy, a new opportunity that genuinely changes the economic landscape. In the 1840s, it was the railroad. For the first time in human history, goods and people could move across vast distances at unprecedented speed. The economic potential was real, and fortunes were made by those who recognized it early. In the 1920s, it was electrification and mass production. Factories that once relied on steam could now run on electric power. Assembly lines made consumer goods affordable for the middle class. Radio connected the nation. The automobile transformed geography itself. In the 1990s, it was the internet, a technology so revolutionary that it would eventually reshape every industry on Earth. In the 2000s, it was financial innovation, securitization, derivatives, the ability to slice and dice risk into instruments so complex that even their creators didn't fully understand them. Combined with government policy encouraging home ownership, it created a machine for turning mortgages into money. The displacement phase is not irrational. The opportunity is real. The early investors are often right, but displacement creates something else, a story, a narrative, a reason to believe that this time is different. And that story is the seed of everything that follows. Once the displacement takes hold, credit begins to expand. Banks, seeing opportunity, loosen their lending standards. Investors, seeing returns, pour in capital. Asset prices begin to rise, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. In the 1920s, broker loans, money lent to investors to buy stocks on margin, exploded from 1.5 billion in 1925 to 8.5 billion by September 1929. Banks were lending money to speculators so they could bet on stocks with only 10% down. In the 2000s, mortgage originations went from $1 trillion in 2000 loss to $3.9 trillion in 2003. Lending standards collapsed. By 2006, you could get a mortgage with no income verification, no down payment, and a credit score that would have disqualified you 5 years earlier. The boom phase feels like prosperity. Employment rises, wealth increases, optimism spreads, but beneath the surface the structure is changing. Debt is replacing equity. Speculation is replacing investment. The gap between asset prices and underlying value is widening, and almost no one notices, because everyone is making money. This is the phase that defines every bubble. Euphoria is when the boom escapes the confines of professional investors and infects the general public. It's when taxi drivers give stock tips, when bartenders flip houses, when your neighbor quits his job to day trade. In 1929, an estimated 1 million Americans were actively trading stocks on margin, in a nation of 120 million. Stock pools manipulated prices openly. The financial press cheered every rally. Joseph Kennedy, father of the future president, famously said he knew it was time to sell when his shoeshine boy started giving him stock tips. In 2006, there were more real estate agents in the United States than there were homes for sale in some markets. Television shows like Flip This House turned speculation into entertainment. Books with titles like Why the Real Estate Boom Will Not Bust line bookstore shelves. Euphoria is characterized by a collective suspension of disbelief. The old rules are declared obsolete. Valuations that would have seemed absurd 2 years earlier are now justified by new paradigms. And something else happens in the euphoria phase. Debt becomes invisible. It's no longer seen as risk. It's seen as leverage, as opportunity, as the smart way to play. The Roman philosopher Seneca warned of this 2,000 years ago. It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it. In financial terms, euphoria is wasted time. It's the period when the system could still self-correct, when prices could gently deflate, when leverage could be unwound, but doesn't, because no one wants the party to end. While the public is still buying, the smart money begins to sell. This phase is almost invisible in real time. There are no headlines, no announcements, just a quiet shift in positioning by those who understand that valuations have become detached from reality. In 1929, several prominent financiers, including Bernard Baruch and Joseph Kennedy, liquidated their stock positions months before the crash. They offered no public warnings. They simply got out. In 2007, hedge fund manager John Paulson made $15 billion betting against subprime mortgages, the largest single-year profit in Wall Street history. Goldman Sachs, while still selling mortgage-backed securities to clients, was quietly building short positions against the very same assets. The profit-taking phase reveals a fundamental truth about financial markets. They are not level playing fields. Information is asymmetric. Access is unequal. The insiders know things the public doesn't, and they act on that knowledge. By the time the average investor realizes the smart money has left, the door is already closing. Panic begins with a crack, a single failure, a missed payment, a bankruptcy that wasn't supposed to happen, something that reveals the hidden fragility beneath the surface. On October 24, 1929, Black Thursday, the stock market suddenly plunged. Nearly 13 million shares traded hands in a single day, a record that would stand for decades. By the end of the week, the market had lost over 25% of its value. On August 9, 2007, BNP Paribas, one of the largest banks in Europe, announced that it could no longer value assets in 3 of its investment funds because liquidity had completely evaporated. It was the first crack in the dam. Panic is not a gradual process, it's a phase transition, like water turning to ice. One day, everyone is buying. The next day, everyone is selling. The mood shifts from greed to fear in hours, and once panic begins, it feeds on itself. Falling prices trigger margin calls. Margin calls force more selling. More selling pushes prices lower. The spiral accelerates. What begins in one market spreads to others. This is the phase where the interconnection of the modern financial system, usually celebrated as efficiency, becomes a transmission mechanism for collapse. In 1929, the stock market crash spread to banks, which had lent heavily to speculators. Bank failures spread to businesses, which could no longer access credit. Business failures spread to workers, who lost jobs and stopped spending. The localized crash became a global depression. In 2008, subprime mortgage defaults spread to mortgage-backed securities. Losses in mortgage-backed securities spread to the banks and insurance companies that held them. The failure of Lehman Brothers spread to money market funds, commercial paper markets, and interbank lending. Within weeks, companies that had nothing to do with housing, General Electric, Caterpillar, McDonald's, found themselves unable to access short-term financing. Contagion reveals the hidden connections in the system. Risks that seem diversified turn out to be correlated. Hedges that seem safe turn out to depend on counterparties that are also failing. In a contagion phase, there is no safe harbor. Everything falls together. The final stage is not just economic. It's psychological, social, political. Despair is when the full scope of the destruction becomes visible, when unemployment lines stretch around blocks, when foreclosure signs dot suburban streets, when the promises of prosperity are revealed as illusions. In 1932, unemployment in the United States reached 25%. Over 10,000 banks had failed. Industrial production had fallen by nearly half. Hoovervilles, shanty towns named mockingly after the president, sprouted in city parks and vacant lots. In 2009, 8 million Americans lost their jobs. Nearly 4 million homes were foreclosed. Retirement accounts lost over $2 trillion in value. The median household lost 40% of its net worth. But despair is also when something else happens. The search for blame, for scapegoats, for someone to hold responsible. In the 1930s, that search led to political extremism across Europe, fascism in Germany and Italy, authoritarianism in Spain. The Great Depression didn't just destroy wealth, it destroyed faith in democratic institutions. It made populations hungry for strongmen who promised simple solutions. In 2009, despair manifested differently. In the Tea Party on the right, Occupy Wall Street on the left. Both movements, however opposed, shared a common conviction. The system was rigged, the elites had failed, and something fundamental was broken. 7 stages. Displacement, boom, euphoria, profit-taking, panic, contagion, despair. This is not a theory, it is a description. A map drawn from 4 centuries of financial history. The pattern repeated in Amsterdam in 1637, in London in 1720, in New York in 1929, and again in 2008. And the evidence suggests it is repeating now. The displacement has already happened. A decade of zero interest rates and quantitative easing created trillions in artificial liquidity. The boom has already happened. Asset prices have soared to record highs while underlying economic growth has stagnated. The euphoria has already happened. Meme stocks, cryptocurrency mania, SPACs, the belief that central banks will never allow prices to fall. The question is, have we already entered the profit-taking phase? And if so, how much time do we have before the panic begins? On September 3, 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average reached 381.17, an all-time high that would not be surpassed for another 25 years. That same week, the economist Irving Fisher, one of the most respected minds in American academia, declared that stock prices had reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. The statement would haunt him for the rest of his life. To understand why 1929 happened, and why it matters for what's coming, you have to understand the world that created it. A world drunk on its own success. A world that had convinced itself the old rules no longer applied. A world that looks uncomfortably like our own. The Roaring Twenties, an empire at its peak. The decade that preceded the crash was unlike anything America had experienced. World War I had devastated Europe but enriched the United States. American factories untouched by bombs had supplied the Allied war effort. American banks, flush with capital, had become the creditors to exhausted European nations. By 1920, the United States had transformed from a debtor nation to the world's largest creditor. The money flowed. Industrial production doubled between 1921 and 1929. Automobile registrations tripled. For the first time, more Americans lived in cities than on farms. Electricity reached 70% of urban homes. Radios, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, technologies that had been luxuries became necessities, and beneath all of it, a revolution in credit. Before the 1920s, most Americans bought what they could afford. If you didn't have the money, you didn't make the purchase. But the post-war decade introduced something new: installment buying. For the first time, ordinary families could purchase a car, a radio, a washing machine, and pay for it later. By 1929, 60% of automobiles and 80% of radios were purchased on credit. Americans had discovered the intoxicating power of borrowed money. But the real speculation wasn't happening in appliance stores. It was happening on Wall Street, the great stock mania. The 1920s stock market was a casino dressed in pinstripes. Between 1924 and 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average rose from 100 to over 380, a gain of nearly 300% in 5 years. Stocks that had no earnings, no dividends, no tangible assets tripled and quadrupled in value. The fuel for this fire was margin lending. In the 1920s, you could buy stocks with as little as 10% down. The rest was borrowed from your broker. If the stock went up, you kept all the gains. If it went down, you faced a margin call, a demand to put up more cash or watch your position be liquidated. This was leverage on a scale never before seen in American markets. And it created a self-reinforcing loop. Rising prices encouraged more borrowing pushed prices higher, higher prices encouraged more borrowing. Broker loans, the money Wall Street lent to speculators, exploded from 1.5 billion in 1925 to 8.5 billion by September 1929. Banks were lending money they had borrowed from the Federal Reserve to fund stock speculation. The entire financial system had become a pyramid scheme of borrowed money betting on borrowed time, but nobody wanted to hear it. The few voices warning of danger were drowned out by the chorus of optimism. John J. Raskob, a senior executive at General Motors, published an article in Ladies' Home Journal titled "Everybody Ought to Be Rich." His thesis: if you invested just $15 a month in stocks, you would be a millionaire within 20 years. The article appeared in August 1929, 7 weeks before the crash, the invisible cracks. Looking back, the warning signs were everywhere, but in real time they were explained away, dismissed, ignored. Agricultural prices had been falling throughout the decade. Farmers, who represented nearly a quarter of the American workforce, were already in depression by 1926. Rural banks were failing at a rate of over 500 per year, a crisis that barely registered in the financial press. Industrial production peaked in June 1929 and began declining 3 months before the stock market crashed. Automobile sales fell, steel production slowed. The real economy was already contracting while the market made new highs. The Federal Reserve, concerned about speculation, had begun raising interest rates in 1928, but the increases were timid, half-hearted, too small to stop the mania, large enough to weaken the underlying economy. And in London, the Bank of England was facing its own crisis. Britain, clinging to the gold standard at an overvalued exchange rate, was hemorrhaging gold reserves. British interest rate increases rippled across the Atlantic, tightening credit in New York at the worst possible moment. The global financial system was interconnected in ways that policymakers barely understood. A decision made in London could trigger a crisis in New York. A failure in Vienna could collapse a bank in Berlin. The world was wired for contagion, and the fuse was about to be lit. October 1929. The fall. The crash came in stages, each wave worse than the last. On Wednesday, October 23rd, the market fell sharply in the final hour of trading. Nearly 6 million shares changed hands, a record volume that overwhelmed the ticker tape machines, leaving traders blind to prices that were already an hour old. On Thursday, October 24th, Black Thursday, panic erupted. The market opened in freefall. By noon, losses had reached catastrophic levels. A group of Wall Street bankers, led by J.P. Morgan's Thomas Lamont, pooled $240 million to buy stocks and stabilize the market. The intervention worked, briefly. The market recovered some losses by the close, but the reprieve was temporary. On Monday, October 28th, the Dow fell 13%, the largest single-day percentage drop in history at that time. There was no rescue this time. The bankers who had saved the market on Thursday were now selling alongside everyone else. On Tuesday, October 29th, Black Tuesday, the bottom fell out entirely. Over 16 million shares were traded. The ticker ran 4 hours behind. Fortunes built over decades were wiped out in minutes. Men who had been millionaires at breakfast were bankrupt by lunch. One trader, watching the chaos from the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, later recalled, "They roared like a lot of lions and tigers. They hollered and screamed. They clawed at one another's collars. In 2 days, the market had lost nearly 25% of its value. By mid-November, $30 billion in market capitalization had evaporated, more than the entire cost of World War I. But the crash was only the beginning, the long fall from crash to depression. What happened after October 1929 was far worse than the crash itself. The stock market, after its initial collapse, actually rallied. By April 1930, it had recovered nearly half its losses. Many believed the worst was over. President Herbert Hoover assured the nation that prosperity was just around the corner. It wasn't. The market resumed its decline, falling month after month, year after year. By July 1932, the Dow had dropped to 41.22, an 89% decline from its 1929 peak. Stocks that had traded at $100 were now worth $5. Stocks that had traded at $50 were worthless. But the real devastation was in the economy. Banks began to fail. In 1930, the Bank of United States, a New York institution with over 400,000 depositors, collapsed. The largest bank failure in American history at that time. The failure triggered runs on other banks. Depositors who had trusted their savings to banks lined up to withdraw their money, only to find the doors locked. Between 1930 and 1933, over 9,000 banks failed. 1/3 of all banks in America simply ceased to exist. And with them went the savings of millions of families. Retirement funds, college savings, life's work reduced to worthless paper. The money supply contracted by nearly 1/3. Credit, the lifeblood of the economy, evaporated. Businesses that had survived the initial crash found themselves unable to borrow, unable to pay suppliers, unable to meet payroll. Unemployment, which had been 3% in 1929, reached 25% by 1933. In some cities, it was far worse. Over 50% in Toledo, 80% in some coal mining towns. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. Families that had been middle class scavenged for food in garbage dumps. The human cost was incalculable. Suicide rates spiked. Marriage rates fell. Birth rates collapsed. A generation of Americans would carry the psychological scars of the Depression for the rest of their lives. A pathological fear of debt, a compulsion to save, a haunted knowledge that everything could be taken away without warning. The political earthquake. Economic collapse breeds political extremism. It always has. It always will. In Germany, the Depression delivered the final blow to the fragile Weimar Republic. Unemployment exceeded 30%. The middle class, wiped out by hyperinflation in 1923 and again by depression in 1930, lost all faith in democratic institutions. Into that vacuum stepped Adolf Hitler, promising to restore German greatness, to punish those responsible, to make the nation whole again. The Nazi Party received 2.6% of the vote in 1928. By 1932, they were the largest party in Germany. By 1933, Hitler was chancellor. In Italy, Mussolini had already consolidated power, but the Depression strengthened his grip. In Spain, economic chaos laid the groundwork for civil war. Across Europe, democracy retreated as strongmen advanced. The United States avoided the worst of this political extremism, but only barely. Father Charles Coughlin, the radio priest, attracted an audience of 30 million with his populist, increasingly anti-Semitic broadcasts. Huey Long, the governor of Louisiana, proposed radical wealth redistribution and was building a national following before his assassination in 1935. Communist Party membership surged. Fascist sympathizers marched in American streets. The institutions held, but they bent further than most Americans today realize. The empire implications for the British Empire, the Great Depression, was a death sentence. Britain had emerged from World War I technically victorious but fundamentally weakened. The war had cost the nation $35 billion, a sum that required massive borrowing from the United States. London, once the undisputed financial capital of the world, now deferred to New York. The Depression accelerated this decline. Britain abandoned the gold standard in 1931, a humiliation that signaled the end of the pound's reign as the world's reserve currency. The empire that had dominated global finance for over a century was now a debtor, dependent on American goodwill. It would take another 2 decades for the full consequences to become visible. The Suez Crisis of 1956 would be the final humiliation, the moment when Britain discovered it could no longer act without American permission. But the seeds were planted in 1929. The lesson unlearned. The Great Depression was not an accident. It was not an act of God. It was the predictable result of leverage, speculation, and institutional failure. The warning signs were visible years in advance. Agricultural distress, bank failures, excessive margin debt, tightening monetary conditions, a global financial system interconnected in ways no one fully understood. All of these signals were ignored, dismissed, explained away. Because in 1929, just as in 2007, just as in 2024, the human capacity for denial is limitless. We believe what we want to believe. We see what we want to see, until we can't. The crash of 1929 destroyed a generation. It took a world war to end the Depression. It took 25 years for the stock market to recover its peak. And yet somehow we convinced ourselves it could never happen again. We were wrong. On the evening of Friday, September 12, 2008, the most powerful men in American finance gathered in an ornate conference room at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. They had been summoned by Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson and Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke. Outside, Manhattan hummed with its usual Friday night energy. Inside, the men who controlled trillions of dollars faced a terrifying truth. The global financial system was 72 hours from collapse. Lehman Brothers, the 158-year-old investment bank, was dying. Its stock had fallen 95% in a year. Its counterparties were refusing to trade. Its $600 billion in assets were melting like ice in summer. But Lehman was not the disease. Lehman was a symptom. The disease had been growing for decades. In the mortgage markets, in the derivatives markets, in the shadow banking system that had metastasized beyond the reach of regulators. By that September weekend, the disease had become terminal. What followed would be the largest financial intervention in human history, and it would change everything. The architecture of disaster. To understand 2008, you have to understand the decisions that made it inevitable. Decisions made years, even decades, before Lehman's collapse. It begins with Alan Greenspan. In 1987, Greenspan became chairman of the Federal Reserve. 2 months into his tenure, the stock market crashed 22% in a single day, still the largest one-day percentage drop in history. Greenspan's response was swift. Flood the system with liquidity, cut interest rates, reassure markets that the Fed would always be there. It worked. The economy recovered. And a lesson was learned, not by Wall Street, but by the Federal Reserve itself. For the next 2 decades, Greenspan repeated the playbook. The savings and loan crisis, the Mexican peso crisis, the Asian financial crisis, the long-term capital management collapse, the dot-com bust. Each time the Fed intervened. Each time the crisis was contained. Each time the underlying problems were papered over with cheaper money. Greenspan called it the Great Moderation, an era when central bank policy had finally tamed the business cycle. Recessions were milder, expansions were longer. The economy seemed to have found a permanent equilibrium. But the Great Moderation was an illusion. What Greenspan had actually done was teach Wall Street that risk had been socialized. Take big bets. If they pay off, you keep the profits. If they fail, the Fed will bail you out. Heads you win, tails the taxpayer loses. This is moral hazard, and it would become the defining feature of 21st century finance. The subprime machine. By 2003, the Federal Reserve had cut interest rates to 1%, the lowest level in 40 years. The official justification was to support recovery from the dot-com bust and the September 11 attacks. The actual effect was to pour gasoline on a housing market already catching fire. When money is cheap, people borrow. And in the 2000s, Americans borrowed to buy houses. Housing prices, which had been roughly stable for generations when adjusted for inflation, began climbing at unprecedented rates. Between 2000 and 2006, the median home price in America doubled. In some markets, Miami, Phoenix, Las Vegas, it tripled. The prices made no sense. Incomes weren't rising. The population wasn't growing faster. There was no fundamental reason for houses to be worth twice as much in 2006 as they had been in 2000. But prices kept climbing. And as they climbed, lending standards collapsed. The traditional mortgage required a 20% down payment, verified income, and a solid credit history. By 2006, you could get a mortgage with nothing down, no income verification, and a credit score that would have disqualified you from a credit card 5 years earlier. These were called ninja loans. No income, no job, no assets. The subprime market, mortgages to borrowers with poor credit, exploded from 35 billion in 1994 to 625 billion in 2005. Nearly 1 in 4 mortgages issued in 2006 was subprime. Who was buying these loans? Everyone. The alchemy of securitization. Here is where the story becomes a hall of mirrors. In the old days, a bank made a mortgage and held it on its books. If the borrower defaulted, the bank took the loss. This gave banks a powerful incentive to lend carefully. But in the 2000s, banks discovered they didn't have to hold mortgages. They could bundle thousands of mortgages together, slice the bundle into pieces with different risk profiles, and sell those pieces to investors around the world. This was securitization, the process of turning illiquid loans into tradable securities. In theory, securitization was supposed to disperse risk. Instead of one bank holding all the risk of a mortgage default, that risk was spread across hundreds of investors globally. In practice, securitization created opacity. Nobody knew who held what. Nobody knew where the risk actually resided. The mortgage your neighbor took out in Phoenix might be owned by a pension fund in Norway, a bank in Germany, an insurance company in Connecticut, and it got worse. Wall Street invented new instruments to bet on mortgage-backed securities, derivatives called collateralized debt obligations, CDOs, and credit default swaps, CDS. A CDO was a security backed by other securities. A CDS was insurance against default, except you didn't need to own the thing you were insuring. It was like being able to buy fire insurance on your neighbor's house, then your neighbor's house, then every house on the block. By 2007, the notional value of the credit default swap market exceeded $60 trillion, more than the entire global economy. The derivatives market as a whole approached $600 trillion. The risk that was supposed to be dispersed had actually been concentrated in institutions so large that their failure would bring down the entire system. The warnings ignored. Just as in 1929, the warning signs were everywhere. In 2004, an FBI official publicly warned that mortgage fraud was becoming epidemic and would cause a financial crisis if not addressed. Nothing was done. In 2005, Raghuram Rajan, the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, presented a paper at an elite economics conference warning that financial innovation had made the system more fragile, not safer. He was mocked. One prominent economist called his argument misguided. In 2006, Nouriel Roubini, later nicknamed Dr. Doom, predicted a severe recession driven by housing collapse, mortgage defaults, and banking crisis. He was dismissed as a perma-bear, a pessimist who saw disaster around every corner. In 2007, housing prices began falling. Subprime defaults spiked. 2 hedge funds at Bear Stearns imploded after betting heavily on subprime securities. In August, BNP Paribas froze 3 investment funds because it could no longer value the mortgage securities inside them. The cracks were visible, the foundation was crumbling, and yet the official position remained. The problems were contained. Ben Bernanke, testifying before Congress in March 2007. The impact on the broader economy and financial markets of the problems in the subprime market seems likely to be contained. Contained, the word would become a bitter joke. Lehman weekend. By September 2008, containment was no longer possible. Bear Stearns had already collapsed in March, sold to JP Morgan in a fire sale arranged by the Federal Reserve. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the government-sponsored enterprises that backed half of all American mortgages, had been nationalized in August. Now, Lehman Brothers was dying. The gathering at the New York Fed that September weekend was supposed to find a solution. Paulson and Bernanke wanted a private sector rescue, another bank to buy Lehman, as JP Morgan had bought Bear Stearns. Barclays was interested. Bank of America was interested. But both wanted government assistance, guarantees against Lehman's most toxic assets. And this time, Paulson said no. The reasons remain disputed. Some say Paulson was trying to draw a line to end the moral hazard that had encouraged reckless behavior. Some say he lacked legal authority. Some say he simply miscalculated. Whatever the reason, at 1:45 a.m. on Monday, September 15, 2008, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. It was the largest bankruptcy in American history. $639 billion in assets gone. The markets opened into chaos. The Dow fell 500 points. Credit markets seized. Banks stopped lending to each other. The TED spread, a measure of fear in the financial system, exploded to levels not seen since the 1987 crash. But the real crisis wasn't Lehman. It was what Lehman revealed. AIG, the world's largest insurance company, had written hundreds of billions in credit default swaps on mortgage securities. When Lehman collapsed, the value of those swaps evaporated. AIG faced $85 billion in collateral calls it couldn't meet. If AIG failed, the banks that held its swaps would fail. If those banks failed, the banks that traded with them would fail. The entire global financial system, every major bank in America, every major bank in Europe, would collapse in a cascade of counterparty failures. On September 16th, the Federal Reserve nationalized AIG with an $85 billion emergency loan. It would eventually grow to $182 billion. The bailout. The next 3 weeks were a blur of emergency measures, congressional battles, and naked fear. On September 20th, Treasury Secretary Paulson proposed the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, a $700 billion fund to buy toxic assets from failing banks. He presented Congress with a 3-page document demanding virtually unlimited authority. On September 29th, the House of Representatives rejected TARP. The Dow fell 777 points, the largest single-day point drop in history. On October 3rd, after frantic negotiations and a market panic, Congress passed a revised TARP. President Bush signed it immediately. But TARP was just the visible part of the rescue. Behind the scenes, the Federal Reserve was engaged in the largest lending operation in its history. Emergency credit facilities, dollar swap lines with foreign central banks, loans to money market funds, commercial paper markets, broker-dealers. A 2011 audit by the Government Accountability Office revealed the true scale. The Federal Reserve had committed over $16 trillion in emergency lending during the crisis. That number exceeded the entire annual GDP of the United States. The system was saved. But at what cost? The hidden transfer. Here is what the official narrative of 2008 leaves out. The crisis was also a transfer of losses from private banks to the public balance sheet, a transfer of risk from Wall Street to Main Street, a transfer of wealth from the middle class to asset holders. The banks were saved. Their executives kept their jobs, their bonuses, their mansions. In 2009, while unemployment approached 10%, and 4 million families lost their homes, Wall Street paid out $145 billion in compensation and benefits. The homeowners were not saved. 4 million foreclosures in 2009 alone. 10 million families underwater on their mortgages. A generation of wealth, built through home equity, wiped out. And the tools used to save the system, quantitative easing, zero interest rates, unlimited Fed support, created the conditions for the next crisis. Asset prices reflated, stock markets soared, but the underlying economy never fully healed. Wages stagnated, manufacturing continued its decline, the middle class hollowed out while the wealthy accumulated assets inflated by cheap money. The The debt was not eliminated. It was transferred from private balance sheets to public balance sheets, from banks to governments, from the present to the future. 2008 didn't end the crisis. It postponed it. Every financial crisis has a trigger. In 1929, it was the tightening of margin requirements and a wave of selling that exposed the leverage beneath the market's surface. In 2008, it was the collapse of subprime mortgages that revealed the rot in the securitization machine. But here is what makes the current moment different and far more dangerous. We are not facing one trigger, we are facing 5. And they are not sequential, they are simultaneous. Each one alone could destabilize the system. Together, they form a constellation of risk unlike anything in modern financial history. Trigger 1. Sovereign debt saturation. On January 2, 2024, the United States national debt crossed $34 trillion for the first time. By the time you watch this, it will likely have crossed $35 trillion. By 2026, it may exceed $37 trillion. These numbers are so large they have lost all meaning. So let's make them concrete. $35 trillion is approximately $100,000 for every man, woman, and child in America. It is more than the entire annual economic output of the United States. It is more than the combined GDP of China, Japan, and Germany. But the debt itself is not the crisis. The crisis is the interest. In 2024, the federal government will pay approximately $870 billion in interest on the national debt. That is more than the entire defense budget. It is more than Medicare. It is more than the combined budgets of education, transportation, and veterans affairs. And it is growing exponentially. For 15 years, the Federal Reserve held interest rates near zero. The government could borrow unlimited sums at virtually no cost. But when inflation surged in 2021 and 2022, the Fed was forced to raise rates at the fastest pace in 40 years. Suddenly, debt that had been rolled over at 0.5% was being refinanced at 4% or 5%. The interest bill exploded. Here is the doom loop that keeps Treasury officials awake at night. As interest payments grow, the government must borrow more to pay them. But more borrowing means more debt. More debt means higher interest payments. Higher interest payments mean more borrowing. This is not speculation. This is arithmetic. The Congressional Budget Office projects that interest payments will consume over 20% of all federal revenue by 2030. By 2040, they could consume 1/3. At some point, and no one knows exactly when, the market loses confidence. Investors demand higher rates to compensate for risk. Higher rates increase the interest burden. The spiral accelerates. This is how sovereign debt crises unfold. It happened to Greece. It happened to Argentina. It happened to Britain in 1976, when the world's former greatest empire was forced to beg the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. The United States is not immune to mathematics. Trigger 2. The commercial real estate time bomb. In the glass towers of Manhattan, in the office parks of suburban Atlanta, in the shopping malls of Middle America, a crisis is unfolding in slow motion. Commercial real estate, offices, retail, hotels, was already under pressure before COVID. The pandemic turned pressure into catastrophe. By 2024, office vacancy rates in major American cities had reached 20%, 25%, in some cases over 30%. San Francisco, once the crown jewel of American commercial real estate, saw vacancy rates exceed 35%. They are structural shifts. The workers are not coming back. The tenants are not returning. But here is what makes this a financial crisis, not just a real estate problem. The debt. American commercial real estate is financed by approximately $4.5 trillion in loans. Of that, roughly $1.5 trillion will mature between 2024 and 2026, meaning borrowers must either refinance or pay off the loans entirely. Refinancing requires two things: a willing lender and adequate collateral. But when your building is worth 40% less than when you bought it, the collateral doesn't exist. And when regional banks are already nervous about their exposure, the willing lenders are scarce. The result is a wave of defaults, foreclosures, and forced sales that is only beginning. In 2023 and 2024, commercial real estate loan defaults hit their highest levels since 2008. Major properties in major cities sold for fractions of their previous values. A San Francisco office tower that sold for $300 million in 2019 sold for $60 million in 2023, an 80% loss. And here is the contagion risk. These loans are not held by Wall Street giants. They are held by regional and community banks, the same banks that provide credit to small businesses, the same banks that hold the checking accounts of ordinary Americans. When Silicon Valley Bank collapsed in March 2023, it was not because of exotic derivatives or subprime mortgages. It was because of a mismatch between assets and liabilities. A mismatch that exists in varying degrees at hundreds of American banks. Commercial real estate defaults could trigger a cascade of regional bank failures. Bank failures could freeze credit to businesses. Frozen credit could trigger recession. Recession could deepen real estate losses. Another doom loop. Another spiral waiting to accelerate. Trigger 3. Shadow banking and private credit. In the aftermath of 2008, regulators imposed new rules on banks. Higher capital requirements. Stress tests. Restrictions on proprietary trading. The rules made banks safer, but they did not eliminate risk. They simply moved it into the shadows. Shadow banking is the term for financial institutions that perform bank-like functions but operate outside traditional banking regulations. Hedge funds, private equity firms, money market funds, private credit vehicles. By 2024, the shadow banking sector controlled approximately $63 trillion in assets globally, larger than the entire traditional banking system, and it is growing at roughly 10% per year. Within shadow banking, the fastest growing segment is private credit, loans made directly by investment funds to companies, bypassing traditional banks entirely. The private credit market has exploded from $500 billion in 2015 to over $1.7 trillion in 2024. Some estimates project it will reach $3 trillion by 2028. This growth has been celebrated on Wall Street as innovation, but innovation in finance often means finding new ways to take old risks. Private credit is opaque. Unlike bank loans, there is no public disclosure of terms, no regulatory oversight, no standardized reporting. Nobody knows exactly who owes what to whom. Private credit is illiquid. Unlike bonds, these loans cannot be easily sold if trouble emerges. When panic hits, there is no exit. Private credit is leveraged. Many private credit funds borrow money to amplify their returns, adding layers of debt on top of debt, and private credit is interconnected. Insurance companies, pension funds, and family offices have poured money into private credit seeking higher yields. When losses materialize, they will spread across the entire institutional investment landscape. The Bank for International Settlements, the central bank of central banks, has warned repeatedly that private credit poses systemic risks. But the warnings have been ignored, just as subprime warnings were ignored in 2006. Just as leverage warnings were ignored in 1928. We are building another financial bomb in another shadow, and this time, we won't see it until it detonates. Trigger 4. Global de-dollarization. Since 1944, the United States dollar has been the foundation of the global financial system. The currency in which oil is priced, the currency in which trade is settled, the currency that central banks hold as reserves. This exorbitant privilege has allowed America to borrow without consequence, to run deficits without penalty, to consume more than it produces for decades. But the privilege is eroding. In 2000, the dollar comprised approximately 72% of global foreign exchange reserves. By 2024, it had fallen to 58%. The decline is accelerating. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and their expanding membership are actively building alternatives. China and Russia now settle their bilateral trade in yuan and rubles. Saudi Arabia has signaled openness to accepting yuan for oil. Central banks globally are accumulating gold at the fastest pace in 60 years. This is not happening because the world loves China. It is happening because the world fears American weaponization of the dollar. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and its allies froze $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves, a sum that was supposed to be safely held in Western financial systems. The message to every other nation was clear. Your dollar reserves are only yours as long as Washington agrees. For countries like China, India, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil, the lesson was unmistakable. Diversify away from the dollar or risk the same fate. The implications for America are severe. If the world holds fewer dollars, demand for American debt falls. If demand for American debt falls, interest rates rise. If interest rates rise, the cost of servicing America's already unsustainable debt explodes. The dollar's dominance has allowed America to borrow its way out of every crisis. De-dollarization closes that exit. Trigger 5. Demographic collapse. This is the trigger nobody wants to discuss. It is slow-moving, invisible, and irreversible. America is aging. The baby boom generation, 76 million strong, is entering retirement. Every day, 10,000 Americans turn 65. By 2030, every single boomer will be over 65. This demographic shift creates 3 interlocking crises. First, the dependency ratio. In 1960, there were 5.1 workers for every Social Security recipient. Today, there are 2.8. By 2035, there will be 2.3. Fewer workers supporting more retirees means either higher taxes, reduced benefits, or both. Second, the entitlement funding gap. Social Security and Medicare are funded primarily by payroll taxes on current workers. As the ratio of workers to retirees falls, the math becomes impossible. The Social Security Trust Fund, already a legal fiction consisting of IOUs the government has written to itself, will be exhausted by 2033. At that point, benefits will automatically be cut by approximately 23% unless Congress acts. Medicare's Hospital Insurance Trust Fund will be exhausted by 2031. The combined unfunded liabilities of Social Security and Medicare exceed $75 trillion, more than 3 times the national debt. Third, the growth problem. Economic growth depends on 2 factors, productivity and labor force growth. With the labor force stagnating and potentially declining, America needs productivity miracles just to maintain current living standards. Japan provides a preview. 3 decades of aging demographics have produced 3 decades of stagnation. The Japanese economy today is barely larger than it was in 1995. Government debt exceeds 260% of GDP. The social contract is fraying. America is not Japan. But America is on Japan's path, with worse debt dynamics and a more fragile political system. The convergence. Any one of these triggers could create a serious crisis. Sovereign debt saturation alone would eventually force a reckoning. Commercial real estate alone could trigger a banking crisis. Shadow banking alone could produce a Lehman-style moment. De-dollarization alone could end America's ability to borrow without consequence. Demographics alone could bankrupt the entitlement system. But they are not alone. They are happening together. They are interacting, amplifying, feeding each other. This is what makes the current moment different from 1929 or 2008. In 1929, debt was high, but demographics were favorable. The population was young and growing. The nation was industrializing. There was capacity for recovery. In 2008, the crisis was severe, but the tools existed. Interest rates could be cut to 0. The Fed could print trillions. The debt, while high, was manageable. In 2026, the tools are exhausted and the problems are multiplying. Interest rates cannot be cut from already low levels without destroying the currency. The Fed cannot print without accelerating de-dollarization. The debt cannot grow without triggering a sovereign crisis. The demographics cannot be reversed without time machines. We are not facing a crisis, we are facing a convergence. And convergences throughout history produce collapses. Empires do not collapse in a day. They decay over decades, sometimes centuries. The process is so gradual that those living through it rarely recognize what is happening. The currency is debased, But slowly. The military overextends, but incrementally. The debt accumulates, but manageably, until suddenly it isn't. And at every stage, the empire's leaders assure their citizens that this time is different, that the nation is exceptional, that the rules that govern the rise and fall of every previous great power somehow do not apply to them. They are always wrong. The pattern of imperial decline is as old as civilization itself. Rome, Persia, the Ottomans, the Mongols. Each believed in their own permanence. Each was mistaken. But for understanding America's current trajectory, three empires are particularly instructive: Habsburg Spain, the British Empire, and the Soviet Union. Each was the dominant power of its age. Each declined through a remarkably similar sequence of stages, and each offers lessons that America has refused to learn. Spain, the gold that became a curse. In 1500, Spain was the rising power of Europe. The marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella had united the Iberian kingdoms. The Reconquista had expelled the last Muslim rulers. And in 1492, a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus had stumbled upon a new world of unimaginable wealth. Within decades, Spanish conquistadors had conquered the Aztec and Inca empires. Ships laden with gold and silver crossed the Atlantic in endless convoys. Between 1500 and 1650, Spain extracted approximately 180 tons of gold and 16,000 tons of silver from the Americas, a transfer of wealth unprecedented in human history. Spain should have become invincible. Instead, the gold destroyed it. The flood of precious metals created inflation that devastated the Spanish economy. Prices quadrupled over the 16th century. Spanish goods became too expensive to compete in European markets. Domestic manufacturing withered as it became cheaper to import everything from abroad. But the deeper problem was what economists would later call the resource curse. Why invest in productive industry when wealth flows from the ground? Why develop your people when you can simply extract? Spain didn't industrialize, it didn't innovate, it consumed, and it borrowed. Despite the rivers of silver flowing from Peru and Mexico, the Spanish crown was perpetually bankrupt. The money was spent as fast as it arrived, on wars in the Netherlands, wars in France, wars against the Ottomans, the disastrous Armada against England. Spain declared sovereign bankruptcy 4 times in the 16th century, alone: 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596. By 1600, the interest on Spain's debt consumed 2/3 of all government revenue. The empire was borrowing to pay interest on previous borrowing, a doom loop that would continue for generations. The military overextension was equally catastrophic. Spain maintained armies across Europe, fleets across the world's oceans, garrisons in the Americas and the Philippines. The cost was staggering, and the returns were diminishing. The 80 Years' War against Dutch independence drained Spanish treasure for 8 decades. The 30 Years' War devastated Spanish possessions in Germany and Italy. By 1648, when the Peace of Westphalia ended the conflict, Spain had lost its position as Europe's dominant power. The decline continued for another century. By 1700, the Spanish Habsburg line had died out, and foreign powers carved up the empire's remaining European possessions. By 1800, Spain was a second-rate power. By 1900, it had lost its last colonies: Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, to an upstart nation called the United States. From peak to irrelevance, 200 years. From dominant empire to historical footnote. The lessons are clear. Wealth without production is a curse. Debt without limit is suicide. Military overextension bleeds empires dry. And once decline begins, it develops its own momentum. Spain learned these lessons too late. Britain would learn them next. Britain, the empire on which the sun set. In 1900, the British Empire was the largest political entity in human history. It controlled 1/4 of the world's land surface and 1/4 of its population. The Royal Navy ruled every ocean. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. London was the undisputed center of global finance. The phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," was not boast, but fact. From Canada to Australia, from India to Africa, from Hong Kong to the Caribbean, British red colored the map of the world. 50 years later, it was over. What happened? War happened. 2 wars. The great conflicts that Britain supposedly won were actually the instruments of its destruction. World War I cost Britain approximately 35 billion, a sum that represented nearly 40% of national wealth. To finance the war, Britain borrowed massively, primarily from the United States. A nation that had been the world's largest creditor in 1914 emerged in 1918 as a debtor. The human cost was equally devastating. Nearly 1 million British soldiers died, an entire generation of young men, the future leaders, the future entrepreneurs, the future fathers, was annihilated in the trenches of France. But Britain maintained the pretense of empire. It expanded its colonial holdings after the war, absorbing former German and Ottoman territories. It maintained the pound's convertibility to gold at pre-war rates, a decision that required brutal austerity and mass unemployment. The Great Depression broke the facade. In 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard. The pound, which had been the anchor of international finance for over a century, was devalued. Other nations followed, and the global monetary system fragmented. World War II finished what the First War had started. By 1945, Britain was victorious but bankrupt. The war had cost another $30 billion. The national debt exceeded 250% of GDP. The empire's military forces were exhausted, its industrial base depleted, its financial reserves gone. Britain survived only because of American support, first through Lend-Lease during the war, then through the Marshall Plan after. The world's greatest empire had become dependent on American charity. The final humiliation came in 1956, when Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain and France launched a military intervention to retake it. The operation was militarily successful, but politically catastrophic. The United States, furious at not being consulted, threatened to crash the pound unless Britain withdrew. President Eisenhower made clear that the age of European colonialism was over, and that America, not Britain, would determine the shape of the post-war world. Britain withdrew. The empire's impotence was exposed for all to see. Within 20 years, virtually every British colony had achieved independence. The pound was devalued repeatedly. Britain's share of global GDP, which had been 9% in 1900, fell to under 3% by 1980. The lessons are clear. Wars accelerate decline. Even wars you win. Reserve currency status can be lost. Debt accumulated for military spending cripples future generations. And when a rising power decides your time is over, there is nothing you can do. Britain's decline was managed. It was relatively graceful. The nation survived, diminished but intact. America may not be so fortunate. America. The unlearned lesson. The parallels are uncomfortable. Like Spain, America has confused financial wealth with productive capacity. The nation that once manufactured half the world's goods now manufactures little but debt. The factories have moved to China. The jobs have moved to services. The wealth has moved to asset prices. Like Spain, America has funded its consumption through borrowing. The trade deficit has averaged over $500 billion per year for 2 decades. The national debt has grown from $5 trillion in 2000 to $35 trillion in 2024. The interest payments now exceed the defense budget. Like Britain, America has exhausted itself through military overextension. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan cost over $8 trillion according to Brown University's Costs of War project. Thousands of American lives were lost, hundreds of thousands of foreign lives were destroyed, and the strategic position of the United States is arguably weaker than when the wars began. Like Britain, America has weaponized its currency, and in doing so, has accelerated the search for alternatives. The dollar's share of global reserves is falling. The petrodollar system is fragmenting. Central banks are accumulating gold at rates not seen in 60 years. And like both Spain and Britain, America's leaders refuse to acknowledge what is happening. They speak of American exceptionalism. They insist that the rules of history do not apply. They assure the public that the debt is manageable, the dollar is unassailable, the military is unmatched. They are repeating the words of every declining empire, and they are making the same mistakes. The three phases of imperial collapse. Across centuries and continents, empire collapse follows a recognizable pattern. Three phases that occur with disturbing regularity. Phase 1, financial dominance masks, real decline. In this phase, the empire remains wealthy, powerful, and confident. But the sources of that wealth are shifting. Production is declining. Consumption is rising. The gap is filled by debt and financial engineering. Spain in the late 1500s, Britain in the 1920s, America since the 1990s. During phase 1, the empire can still project power. Its currency is still trusted, its military is still feared, but the foundation is eroding beneath the surface. Phase 2. Debt servicing consumes productive capacity. In this phase, the cost of maintaining the empire exceeds the empire's productive capacity. Interest payments consume an ever larger share of revenue. Military commitments strain the budget. Investment in infrastructure, education, and innovation is sacrificed to service past obligations. Spain in the early 1600s, Britain in the 1940s, America today. During phase 2, decline becomes visible to careful observers, but is denied by the establishment. The rhetoric of exceptionalism grows louder as the reality of decline grows clearer. Phase 3. Sudden loss of confidence triggers rapid fall. In this phase, something breaks. A military defeat, a currency crisis, a default, an event that reveals the empire's weakness to the world. The fall, when it comes, is shockingly fast. Decades of gradual decline compress into years or months of rapid collapse. Spain's loss of the Netherlands, Britain's Suez humiliation, the Soviet Union's dissolution. The historical record suggests that the transition from phase 2 to phase 3 typically takes 10 to 15 years, sometimes less. America entered phase 2 sometime in the 2010s. The debt crossed sustainable thresholds. The interest burden began its exponential climb. The military commitments continued without strategic purpose. If history is a guide, America has perhaps a decade before phase 3 begins, perhaps less. There is a comfortable assumption embedded in the modern financial mind that we have learned from history, that the regulators who failed in 1929 have been replaced by sophisticated technocrats, that the tools unavailable in the Great Depression, quantitative easing, deposit insurance, coordinated central bank intervention, now protect us from the worst outcomes. That the global financial system, despite its complexity, is fundamentally safer than it was a century ago. This assumption is wrong. The next crisis will not be a repeat of 1929 or 2008, it will be worse. Not because we have learned nothing, but because the very tools we used to survive previous crises have created new vulnerabilities. Not because the system is the same, but because it has evolved in ways that amplify rather than dampen shocks. The compounding factors are numerous, and they are converging. The debt multiplier. Start with the simplest measure. How much debt exists relative to the economy's ability to service it? In 1929, total US debt, public and private combined, stood at approximately 150% of GDP. This was considered dangerously high. The deleveraging that followed contributed to a decade of depression. In 2008, when Lehman collapsed, total US debt had reached approximately 350% of GDP, more than double the 1929 level. The crisis was contained only through unprecedented intervention, trillions in bailouts, guarantees, and money creation. In 2025, total US debt exceeds 420% of GDP. Government debt alone exceeds 120% of GDP. Corporate debt is at all-time highs. Household debt has surpassed 2008 levels. Student loan debt exceeds $1.7 trillion. Credit card debt exceeds $1.1 trillion. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. So let us make them concrete. If you earn $100,000 per year and owe $420,000, you are not financially healthy. You are one missed paycheck, one medical emergency, one job loss away from catastrophe. The interest alone consumes a crippling share of your income. Every new expense requires new borrowing. You are not building wealth, you are renting the appearance of it. This is America's balance sheet. This is the foundation on which the next crisis will unfold. But debt levels alone do not capture the danger. The structure of debt matters as much as its quantity. In 1929, most debt was simple. Bonds, bank loans, mortgages. The chain of obligation was short and visible. When defaults occurred, the losses were painful but traceable. Today, debt has been sliced, diced, tranched, securitized, and derivatized into instruments so complex that even their creators cannot fully map the web of counterparty risk. The chain of obligation stretches around the world, through dozens of institutions across multiple jurisdictions. When Lehman failed in 2008, nobody knew who was exposed. Nobody knew which banks held the toxic paper. Nobody knew where the losses would land. That uncertainty, as much as the losses themselves, is what froze the global financial system. The system today is more complex, more interconnected, and more opaque than it was in 2008. The next Lehman will be worse because the next web will be thicker. The derivatives overhang. Consider the derivatives market. A derivative is a financial contract whose value is derived from something else: a stock, a bond, a commodity, an interest rate, a currency. Derivatives can be used to hedge risk. They can also be used to speculate with enormous leverage. In 2008, the notional value of the global derivatives market was approximately $600 trillion. The unraveling of just one corner of that market, credit default swaps on mortgage securities, nearly destroyed the financial system. Today, the notional value of the global derivatives market exceeds $700 trillion by some estimates. Interest rate derivatives alone exceed $500 trillion. This is not money that exists, this is exposure. This is the sum of bets that have been placed on the direction of markets. To put this in perspective, $700 trillion is approximately 8 times the entire global GDP. It is more than the value of every stock, every bond, every piece of real estate, every commodity on earth combined. When markets move in unexpected ways, derivatives amplify the movement. Hedges that were supposed to protect become sources of loss. Margin calls cascade through the system. Institutions that seem solvent discover they are not. This is what happened in March 2020, when COVID panic triggered a brief but violent derivatives-driven crash that required the Federal Reserve to inject $4 trillion in liquidity within weeks. This is what happened in September 2022 when British pension funds nearly collapsed because of leveraged derivatives bets on interest rates, forcing the Bank of England to intervene in an emergency bond buying program. These were warning shots, tremors before the earthquake, and each intervention required more extreme measures than the last. The derivatives market is not a stabilizer, it is an accelerant, and it has never been larger. The speed problem. In October 1929, the crash unfolded over days. The ticker tape ran hours behind. Traders made decisions based on information that was already obsolete. The chaos was terrible, but it was slow enough for humans to process. In 2008, the crisis accelerated over weeks. Lehman's collapse triggered contagion that spread across time zones. But there was still time, barely, for officials to convene, to negotiate, to cobble together rescues. In the next crisis, the speed will be measured in minutes. Algorithmic trading now accounts for approximately 70% of all stock market volume. High-frequency trading firms execute thousands of transactions per second. The algorithms are designed to detect patterns and exploit them faster than any human could react. When markets turn, the algorithms turn together. They have no loyalty, no fear, no hope. They execute their programming. And when that programming says sell, they all sell simultaneously. On May 6, 2010, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell nearly 1,000 points in minutes, i.e. flash crash, triggered by algorithmic feedback loops. Trillion-dollar companies saw their stocks trade at 1 cent. The market recovered within hours, but the vulnerability was exposed. On August 24, 2015, another flash crash. On February 5th, 2018, another. On March 9th, 2020, another. Each time, Circuit breakers halted trading to prevent complete collapse. Each time, the official explanation was technical factors. But here is what the officials don't say. In a true crisis, the circuit breakers may not be enough. When panic is real, when Lehman-scale defaults are occurring, halting trading does not halt reality. It merely delays the recognition of losses that have already occurred. The algorithms have never been tested in a true systemic crisis. Nobody knows what happens when the machines try to sell and there are no buyers. Nobody knows how fast the contagion can spread when decisions are made in microseconds. The next crash could be over before anyone understands it has begun. The exhaustion of central banks. In 1929, the Federal Reserve failed to act. It allowed the money supply to contract by 1/3. It let banks fail by the thousands. This failure is now recognized as one of the great policy errors in economic history. The lesson was learned, perhaps too well. In 2008, the Federal Reserve acted decisively. It cut interest rates to zero. It launched quantitative easing, purchasing trillions in bonds to inject liquidity into the system. It opened emergency lending facilities for banks, broker-dealers, money market funds, foreign central banks. It did, in Ben Bernanke's words, whatever it takes. It worked. The system was saved. But the tools that saved 2008 cannot save the next crisis. They have already been used, and their side effects have created new vulnerabilities. Interest rates spent nearly a decade at zero after 2008. When inflation finally surged in 2021-2022, the Fed was forced to raise rates, but from such a low base that normal rates now feel crushing. The economy has become addicted to cheap money. Withdrawing it causes convulsions. The Fed's balance sheet, which stood at $900 billion before 2008, exploded to $4.5 trillion after. COVID pushed it to $9 trillion. Any attempt to reduce it triggers market tantrums. The Fed is trapped by its own interventions. And here is the deeper problem. The next crisis will require even larger interventions than 2008 or 2020, but each intervention erodes confidence in the currency. Each round of money printing devalues the savings of ordinary people. Each bailout demonstrates that the system runs on favoritism, not rules. At some point, the cure becomes worse than the disease. At some point, printing more dollars accelerates the flight from dollars. At some point, the Fed's credibility, the only thing that gives its paper value, is exhausted. We may be closer to that point than anyone wants to admit. The doom loop. European policymakers coined this term during the sovereign debt crisis of 2010-2012. It describes a feedback loop between government debt and banking weakness. Here is how it works. Banks hold large quantities of government bonds. They are considered safe assets. When government finances deteriorate, the value of those bonds falls. When bond values fall, bank balance sheets weaken. When banks weaken, governments must prepare to bail them out. When governments prepare bailouts, their debt increases. When debt increases, bond values fall further. Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Italy, each experienced some version of this doom loop. The European Central Bank ultimately had to intervene with unlimited bond-buying commitments to break the cycle. America has avoided this dynamic so far because the dollar is the world's reserve currency. Foreign governments and investors have been willing to hold American debt regardless of the underlying fiscal position. The exorbitant privilege has insulated America from consequences that would have devastated any other nation. But privilege can be lost. American banks hold over $4 trillion in treasury securities and government-backed bonds. If confidence in American fiscal sustainability wavers, if interest rates spike not because of Fed policy, but because of risk premium, those holdings will lose value. Bank balance sheets will weaken. The 2023 regional banking crisis, triggered in part by bond losses, will look like a gentle preview. The doom loop has not arrived in America, but the conditions for its arrival are assembled. And once it begins, it is very difficult to stop. Political paralysis. Perhaps the most dangerous compounding factor is the one hardest to quantify: the collapse of institutional capacity. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt took office and within 100 days had passed 15 major pieces of legislation transforming the American financial system. The Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial and investment banking. The Securities Act regulated stock offerings. The FDIC insured bank deposits. Agreement was possible because a shared sense of emergency overrode partisan division. In 2008, the TARP bailout passed only after a failed first vote triggered a market collapse that terrified Congress into action. Even then, it was controversial. The compromises weakened the response. The divisions foreshadowed what was to come. Today, Congress cannot agree on basic functions of government. Debt ceiling standoffs have become routine. Shutdowns have become normalized. The prospect of a bipartisan response to financial crisis, the kind of unified action that characterized 1933 or even 2008, seems almost unimaginable. If the next crisis hits, who will lead the response? A Federal Reserve whose independence is under political attack? A Treasury Department serving a polarized administration? A Congress where compromise is treated as betrayal? The machinery of crisis response assumes institutional competence and political will. Both are in doubt, and this may be the most frightening compounding factor of all. Not that the crisis will be larger, but that the response will be smaller. Not that the system will face greater stress, but that the institutions meant to manage that stress have themselves decayed. Spain had Philip II. Britain had Churchill. Rome had its emperors. Who will America have? We speak of financial collapse in abstractions, numbers on screens, percentages, indices, trillion-dollar figures that have no relationship to lived experience. But collapse is not an abstraction. It is not a line on a chart. It is the moment when the money in your pocket buys half what it bought last month. It is the moment when the bank where you deposited your life savings closes its doors. It is the moment when the job you trained for, the career you built, the future you planned, simply ceases to exist. Collapse is not something that happens to economies. It happens to people. And if you want to understand what may be coming, you cannot look at models. You must look at history, at the societies that have already walked this path, at the human wreckage they left behind. Weimar, when money dies. In January 1919, $1 was worth approximately 8.9 German marks. By November 1923, $1 was worth 4.2 trillion marks. This was the Weimar hyperinflation, the most famous currency collapse in modern history. And it did not happen because Germany was poor or unproductive. It happened because Germany tried to pay debts it could not afford. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed crushing reparations on Germany, $33 billion, an amount equivalent to roughly $500 billion today. Germany did not have this money. It could not earn this money, so it printed it. At first, the inflation was manageable. Prices rose, but wages followed. Germans adjusted. But printing accelerated. And at some point, economists still debate exactly when confidence broke. People stopped believing the mark would hold its value. They spent it as fast as they received it. Velocity exploded. Prices doubled, not yearly, not monthly, but daily. The stories from Weimar are almost impossible to believe. Workers were paid twice a day, so they could spend their wages before they became worthless. Wheelbarrows of cash were needed to buy a loaf of bread. A cup of coffee would cost more when you finished drinking it than when you ordered it. Life savings accumulated over decades bought nothing, literally nothing. But the economic devastation was only part of the catastrophe. Hyperinflation destroyed the German middle class. The teachers, the doctors, the shopkeepers, the civil servants who had saved responsibly, who had followed the rules, who had trusted the institutions. Their prudence was punished, their trust was betrayed, everything they had worked for evaporated, and into that vacuum of shattered expectations stepped the extremists. The Nazi Party was a fringe movement in 1923. It gained its first real foothold during the hyperinflation, when Hitler's promises of national renewal and scapegoat blaming found fertile soil among the dispossessed. The party was suppressed after the failed beer hall putsch, but the grievances it exploited never faded. When the Great Depression struck a decade later, those grievances exploded. The Nazis rose from 2.6% of the vote in 1928 to 37% in 1932. Hitler became chancellor in January 1933. The through line from Weimar inflation to Auschwitz is not direct. History is never that simple, but the connection is real. Economic collapse creates political monsters. Always has, always will. Argentina, the permanent crisis. If Weimar shows what happens when a currency dies suddenly, Argentina shows what happens when it dies slowly, over and over again. Argentina entered the 20th century as one of the wealthiest nations on earth. In 1913, its per capita income exceeded that of France, Germany, and Italy. Buenos Aires was called the Paris of South America. The future seemed limitless. A century later, Argentina has experienced 6 sovereign defaults: 1951, 1956, 1982, 1989, 2001, 2014. Multiple hyperinflations. 1989, 1990 saw prices rise 3,000% in a single year. Currency collapses so routine that Argentines have lived through 5 different currencies in living memory. Repeated cycles of boom, bust, crisis, and false recovery. The pattern is always the same. A populist government spends beyond its means. Debt accumulates, the currency weakens, inflation accelerates, the government imposes controls, price freezes, capital restrictions, exchange rate pegs. The controls create distortions. Black markets flourish. The official economy withers. Eventually, something breaks. Default, devaluation, crisis, and then the cycle begins again. What does this do to a society? It destroys trust. Argentines do not trust their banks. They remember when accounts were frozen and converted to devalued pesos overnight. They do not trust their currency. They conduct major transactions in dollars, smuggled in or held abroad. They do not trust their government. They have watched too many promises evaporate. And so Argentina, blessed with fertile land, educated people, and abundant resources, remains trapped in permanent crisis. Not because it lacks wealth, but because it has destroyed the institutions that allow wealth to be preserved and allocated. This is what chronic collapse looks like. Not a single catastrophe, but an endless series of wounds that never fully heal. A nation perpetually starting over, perpetually betrayed, perpetually poorer than it should be. The Soviet collapse. When systems fail on December 25th, 1991, the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. A superpower that had controlled half of Europe, that had sent the first human into space, that had possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy civilization several times over, simply ceased to exist. The collapse happened with stunning speed. In January 1991, the Soviet Union still appeared intact. By December, it was gone. 15 new nations emerged from the wreckage, but the human cost unfolded over years. Russian GDP fell by approximately 40% during the 1990s, a peacetime economic contraction without parallel in modern history. Male life expectancy dropped from 64 years in 1990 to 57 years in 1994. Alcoholism, suicide, and cardiovascular disease killed millions of men in their working years. The Soviet system had been inefficient, corrupt, and stagnant, but it had provided a social contract. Guaranteed employment, free healthcare, subsidized housing, predictable pensions. When the system collapsed, the contract was voided. Pensioners who had worked their entire lives for the state found their savings worthless and their pensions unpaid. Factories that had employed entire cities closed overnight. Professionals, engineers, scientists, teachers became street vendors or taxi drivers. The social order inverted. The criminal and the connected thrived. The honest and the hardworking suffered. What emerged was not the liberal democracy that Western advisors had promised. It was an oligarchy, a system where a handful of well-positioned insiders stripped state assets for pennies on the dollar, while ordinary Russians starved. The loans for shares program transferred the nation's oil, gas, and mineral wealth to men who would become billionaires while teachers went unpaid for months. The trauma of the 1990s explains much about modern Russia. The appeal of Vladimir Putin was not despite the chaos of that decade, but because of it. He offered order after anarchy, stability after collapse, restoration of national pride after humiliation. The Soviet collapse was a political event, but its consequences were economic, social, psychological, generational, The scars remain visible 30 years later. Which path for America? Financial crises typically resolve in one of two ways. The first is deflationary collapse. What happened in the 1930s? Credit contracts. Prices fall. Assets lose value. Debts become impossible to service. Defaults cascade. Unemployment soars. The economy shrinks violently until it reaches a new, lower equilibrium. The second is inflationary collapse. What happened in Weimar? In Argentina. In Zimbabwe. The government prints money to service debts it cannot pay through taxation. The currency loses value. Prices spiral. Savings evaporate. The economy collapses not through contraction but through the destruction of the measuring stick itself. Both paths are catastrophic. Both destroy wealth. Both shatter social trust. Both breed political extremism. America in 2026 faces a particular danger. It may experience elements of both. Asset prices could collapse as bubbles burst and leverage unwinds. A deflationary shock. The Federal Reserve, faced with systemic crisis, could respond with unlimited money printing. An inflationary shock. The result would be the worst of both worlds. Falling asset values for those who own them, rising prices for those who don't. This is not theoretical. This is what happened in 2022-2023, when markets fell while inflation surged. It was a preview, a warning. Who survives history offers uncomfortable lessons about who weathers collapse. Those with hard assets, land, precious metals, productive property, tend to preserve wealth across currency crises. Paper fortunes evaporate. Tangible assets endure. Those with essential skills, the ability to grow food, repair machinery, provide medical care, build shelter, find their labor in demand regardless of what happens to financial markets. Those with strong communities, extended families, religious congregations, tight-knit neighborhoods, have support systems that do not depend on functioning institutions. Those with mobility, the ability to move, to relocate, to access opportunities elsewhere, can escape the worst impacts of localized collapse. What does not survive? Leveraged wealth, paper promises, complex financial arrangements, dependency on systems that require everything to function normally. The middle class, caught between the rich who can insulate themselves and the poor who have already adapted to hardship, typically suffers most in systemic collapse. They have the most to lose and the fewest tools to protect it. The question we cannot answer: is this decline already irreversible? History suggests that once an empire enters the late stages of decay, once debt has passed sustainable thresholds, once the currency has begun its debasement, once institutional trust has eroded beyond repair, the trajectory is set. Management of decline becomes possible. Reversal does not. Spain could not reverse. Britain could not reverse. Rome could not reverse. Perhaps America will be different. Perhaps the patterns of 4,000 years of history will not apply. Perhaps exceptional nations exist. Or perhaps the belief in exceptionalism is itself the final symptom of decline, the denial that makes reversal impossible. In 1889, a Scottish journalist named Charles Mackay published a revised edition of his masterwork, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. The book documented centuries of financial manias, the South Sea bubble, the Mississippi scheme, tulip mania. Mackay's conclusion, written nearly 150 years ago, remains the most accurate description of human financial behavior ever committed to paper. Men, it has been well said, think in herds. It will be seen that they go mad in herds, while they only recover their senses slowly and one by one. This is the pattern. This is what we refuse to see. Every generation believes it has learned from the mistakes of the past. Every generation believes its technologies are different, its leaders wiser, its systems more sophisticated. Every generation watches the warnings accumulate and dismisses them as pessimism, as doomsaying, as failure to understand why this time is different. And every generation is wrong. The Romans believed their empire was eternal. They had conquered the known world. Their laws governed millions. Their roads connected continents. Their currency was accepted from Britain to Mesopotamia. But the currency was debased slowly over centuries. The silver content of the denarius fell from 95% to less than 5%. Taxes rose to fund armies that could no longer hold the frontiers. The middle class retreated to rural estates. The cities hollowed out. And one day the barbarians who had been held at bay for 500 years simply walked through gates that no one was left to defend. The Romans did not see it coming. They could not see it coming. Because the decline was so gradual, so incremental, so easily explained away by those who had the most to lose from acknowledging it. The British believed their empire would last 1,000 years. Churchill said so explicitly. The sun would never set on British dominion, but the debts accumulated. The colonies grew restless. The world wars drained the treasury and killed the youth. And in 1956, when Britain tried to act like the great power it believed itself to be, America made a single phone call. The empire ended not with a bang, but with a humiliating withdrawal from a canal in Egypt. Within a generation, Britain was a medium-sized European nation, struggling to find its place in a world it had once ruled. The Soviets believed history was on their side. Marxist theory guaranteed the triumph of communism. The workers of the world would unite. Capitalism would collapse under its own contradictions. And then, in the span of a few years, it was the Soviet Union that collapsed. Not because it was invaded, not because it was conquered, but because the gap between what the system promised and what it delivered became too vast to ignore. The people stopped believing. And once belief was gone, the structures that depended on it crumbled into dust. And now, America, the nation that emerged from World War II as the most powerful country in human history. The nation whose currency became the foundation of global finance. The nation whose military bases span the planet. The nation whose culture, for better or worse, has colonized the imagination of the world. This nation now owes $35 trillion. Its interest payments exceed its defense budget. Its infrastructure crumbles while its financial assets soar. Its middle class hollows out while its billionaires multiply. Its political system paralyzes itself while the challenges mount. The warning signs are everywhere. They are in the debt figures. They are in the demographic projections. They are in the empty office towers and the unfunded pensions and the derivatives that no one fully understands. And yet the music plays on. The markets rise. The experts reassure. The politicians promise. This time is different, they say. It never is. 1929 destroyed a generation. The trauma shaped American life for 50 years. Those who lived through it never forgot the breadlines, the foreclosures, the suicides, the years of wandering in search of work that did not exist. 2008 hollowed out the middle class. The wealth that was lost in home equity, in retirement accounts, in economic opportunity has never been recovered by those who lost it. The bailouts saved the system, but broke something deeper. The belief that the rules applied equally to everyone. And 2026? Perhaps nothing happens. Perhaps the debt is managed, the triggers diffused, the decline arrested. Perhaps American exceptionalism is real and the patterns of history do not apply. Or perhaps the historians of the next century will look back at this moment, at the debt, at the denial, at the fraying institutions and the polarized politics, and wonder why we did not see what was so clearly coming. They will have the benefit of hindsight. We do not. We have only the pattern. The same pattern that has repeated for 400 years. The same pattern that claims Spain and Britain and Rome. The warning is there. It has always been there. The only question is whether we will hear it.